The Man of God Network exists to help the church in her mission to identify and equip qualified, faithful men for the gospel ministry and for the recovery of biblical reformation in our day. It's our joy to provide you with resources that both encourage you and edify you as you seek to build Christ Church where you are, to the end that He is better known, loved, and exalted. We appreciate the support of our listeners. To learn more about how you can help us accomplish our mission, visit manofgodnetwork.com.
The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective.
We pray you find this resource edifying, faithful to Scripture, and Christ exalting. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. We're on the Man of God Network, brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. And in this discussion, we have the opportunity to speak with Andre Gazal. So welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
And the topic of our conversation today is a book that you have edited. The original author of the book is Thomas Patient, and the title of the book is The Doctrine of Baptism. So that's the title of our episode today. The Doctrine of Baptism by Thomas Patient with Andre Gazal. But brother, before we begin to talk about this book that you have edited, again, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you and glad to have this conversation on this particular Baptist with you. But since you are a first-time guest to our show, can you tell our audience just a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. Very briefly, I hold degrees from Asbury College, an undergraduate degree in history, a master's degree with a concentration in historical theology from Reformed Theological Seminary, and a PhD in historical theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. Most of my ministry has been in an educational context. I taught in a Christian school, specifically high school, where I taught history for about 9 years, and then after that, I then worked on my doctorate, and then I was involved in teaching and administrating at a Bible college in the North Pacific. Then that was followed by teaching in the graduate school of in the areas of theology, mainly historical and systematic theology at Northland International University in Dunbar, Wisconsin. And 3 years ago, I accepted the call to come here to Montana Bible College, where I serve as a vice president of academic affairs and a professor of church history.
Excellent. Well, I've always wanted to go to Montana. I bet the weather is great around this time of year. I'm in Southeast Texas, where it's triple-digit heat index on a daily basis from about mid-May till about mid-September, late September. So, Andre, we're so delighted to have you. Appreciate the insight as to what the Lord has done in and through you academically and in your ministry endeavors. Now that we're going to transition into our discussion on our book of our topic of discussion today regarding your book. I just want to let you know personally, I've really enjoyed reading it. It has begun to make some significant traction in the social media world amongst the particular Baptist crowd. And I think to our listeners who are not familiar with this book, they would do well to check it out. And they would be tremendously blessed by recovering this great work from church history. I was wondering, Andre, though, just to kind of get our conversation started on this direction, sure, would you be willing to share a little bit about what goes into the republication process regarding a book of this nature? Maybe a little bit about your experience with H&E Publishing and just in general what it looks like to edit a work that was originally written over 300 years ago.
That's a great question, Dewey. Thanks very much. Well, on the one hand, undertaking a project like this is not for the faint-hearted. It requires God's grace first and foremost. God's grace specifically in enhancing our capacity for patience and perseverance. But in that respect, the editing process involves, first of all, making one's way through a 17th century work that would have been printed in this case in 1654. And in any work written during this period, you're having to deal with a number of issues. For one thing, you have to deal with some of the idiosyncrasies of printing. Sometimes 17th century printing is a pretty hit and miss. So sometimes you have to be aware for little details, such as discrepancies in punctuation sometimes. Maybe the printer didn't quite get a word completely right. So there are those kinds of little idiosyncrasies you have to deal with. Sometimes sort of archaic vocabulary, and so the first thing I would begin with here is, well, how do you access a work like this in the first place? Do you go? I mean, it used to be years ago. If you're going to do something like this, you would travel, in this case, to the UK. You'd get various permissions to access various rare book rooms, and there you'd have to really economize your time carefully to make your way through this kind of a work. Nowadays, by God's grace, the task has been somewhat simplified by all kinds of media, like in this case, early English books online, which you can access through a membership in the Renaissance Society of America. If you join that, then one of the perks for membership in the Renaissance Society of America is a subscription to early English books online. And the neat thing about early English books online is that it has available by way of PDF files, which you can access and download. Every single book that had been printed in England since the invention of the printing press, from that time in the 15th century or so to about the 18th century, and then there's a whole other series after that. But as far as early English books online is concerned, that you have this veritable treasure trove of all these different printed works, which you can access, and that is how I was able initially to access this work by patient. So you have the work, you have the actual 17th century text, and then so you have to do two things. Unless you have the sophisticated software to do it all within the PDF, most of the time you end up transcribing the whole text, first of all. In my case, I transcribed it on a word for word on a Word document, and in so doing, you're trying to do a couple things, because what you're wanting to do here is you're doing this for a certain audience. You're doing this for a general audience, in this case, who are members of Baptist churches, who may be wanting to inquire further into various aspects of Baptist heritage, and therefore you're trying to revive awareness of this text, and in order to do that, you want to make the text as accessible to that audience as possible, and at the same time, you want to retain the original of that text as much as possible. Now, and there's a balancing act in that regard. For one thing, you modernize the spelling. In the 17th century, the rules for spelling and grammar were not necessarily uniform. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to conform some of the odd 17th century spelling to present day conventions in English. Another thing that one does is when you come across certain archaic words, depending on the archaic word, you try to do one of two things. Either you try in the text, you come up with a modern equivalent. And for me personally, that's the less desirable option, because what you want to do is you want to retain as much of the original as possible. Alternatively, what you could do is, and this is what I did in this particular work most of the time, if there was an archaic word of some kind, then I just simply provide a definition of that in a footnote. And that was another feature of this work, is that we were very careful to footnote various references and allusions that patient would make to a number of things, like the Book of Common Prayer, with which he would have been familiar because he was raised in the Church of England until he became a Congregationalist, and then sometime, or an independent, I should say. Don't want to sound too anachronistic here, but he was an independent, and then it was as an independent he adopted Baptist convictions. But nevertheless, before that, he, having been born in 1591, he would have been raised in the Church of England. He would have been familiar with the Book of Common Prayer. So when he makes reference to that, then I would have provided an explanatory footnote for some aspect of that, and also other such references that he would make. So that was also an important thing that we tried to do. And we also tried to distinguish between various marginal references he would make himself, like to a scripture passage or something like that, which we would put in footnotes, and then we would just leave those in the footnotes as they are. And then if there was an additional comment on my part, I would try to insert those in brackets so the reader would be able to distinguish between patient's own notes in this case and my own comments. So it's a painstaking process, and one that requires dedication. I would say that is also one that requires a calling. You have to be called to do something like that, just given the significant commitment that it requires. So, just to recap, you read through the work, you then transcribe the work onto a Word document, recreating the text, if you would, by placing it there by means of modern conventions of modern English, spelling and so forth, making necessary explanatory footnotes throughout, so the reader will be able to track with the author himself, and then it's also very helpful to write an introduction to the author, his context, his background, the work itself, the circumstances under which it was written, its main argument, and so forth, so that the reader is then able to situate the work in that author's particular context. The object here is to bring the author himself from his world, in this case out of the 17th century, to the early 21st century reader, and doing so in a way that his voice, his original voice, is maintained as much as possible, but at the same time, efforts are made to make that voice plain and accessible to the present day reader.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful I would imagine that some of our listeners to our show not only have an interest in the particular Baptists of the 17th century, or maybe even Thomas Patient in particular, but are aspiring Baptist historians, or maybe would one day want to become a Baptist historian. So walking through this re-editing process has been helpful for ways that potentially other listeners in the future could help recover some other Baptistic works. But transitioning our conversation a little bit and following up with something that you alluded to in your last answer, you did mention that you wrote an introduction. And one thing that we wanted to know more about for this conversation was, who was Thomas Patient? We do think that maybe by giving a little bit of a biographical sketch, it might whet our listeners' appetite, to learn more about this work in particular and this particular Baptist. So can you tell us who Thomas Patient was?
Certainly. Well, Thomas Patient was a prominent leader of the Baptist movement in Ireland during the period of the protectorship under Oliver Cromwell, during the period of the Commonwealth following the English Civil War. And so Patient was a prominent leader in establishing the Baptist movement there in Ireland during that period. Now, I alluded to something a little earlier about his life. He was born in Devonshire to a Church of England family. By this time in 1591, the majority of the English would have been part of the Church of England, and as a matter of course, as with anybody who would have been raised in the Church of England at this time in the late 16th century, he was baptized as an infant, and so forth. The interesting thing is, we don't know a whole lot about his early life. Just about all that we have concerning his early life comes from Patient's own introductory preface to the Doctrine of Baptism, where he goes into something of a biographical sketch about himself. So, from what we understand, he went to Winchester College, which in that context would have been equivalent to a secondary, what we would regard today as a secondary school. We don't know for sure whether he went to university or not. It seems that he might. It's very likely that he might have, and if he did, it most likely would have been Cambridge. But he doesn't tell us that. So as I said, there's as far as his early life is concerned, there's a lot more that we don't know than there is that we do know, other than what he's related to us himself. Well, sometime while he was in England, during this period, he like many during the first part of the 17th century, he abandoned some of the doctrines and practices of the Church of England in favor of independency. So he became something of an independent, which was one of the types of Puritans that we had. Probably the most famous of independents in the 17th century was John Owen. So he became an independent from his own testimony, and then in 1628, 1629, he then traveled over to Massachusetts with the Puritans on the Arabella, where John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, gave his famous address, a model of Christian charity. So Patient was among those Puritans who had traveled over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and while he was in Massachusetts, as he was listening to various Puritan sermons, he started developing questions about the validity of baptism. And by his own account, he read Scripture very closely and carefully. He prayed, he meditated. By the way, he also goes through in his preface to the reader there in his Doctrine of Baptism, he relates that he experienced something of an existential crisis, of an existential spiritual crisis while dealing with this whole question of baptism. Well, and finally, he came to some very firm conclusions based on his reading and understanding of Scripture that infant baptism was not biblically valid, and therefore, in his estimation, not a legitimate baptism at all. And now the problem with this is, there's one thing to draw this kind of conclusion on your own. That it's another thing to publicly advocate for that position, especially in a place like Puritan Massachusetts. Without going into all the details of this, in Puritan Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to question infant baptism, as certainly a more famous dissenter did there by the name of Roger Williams, as well as in another one by the name of John Clark. This was viewed as a threat to the society, and one question. Now, this is a theory that I've had, and this is a theory that I have advanced for quite a long time, and that is that the idea that what we would call magisterial Protestants. All right, and by magisterial Protestants, I mean simply particularly those reformers, Luther, Calvin, etc., whose reform programs depend upon the sympathy and support of the magistrate. All assumed the societal construct of Christendom. Now, by this time, it wouldn't have been Christendom in the medieval sense of a comprehensive society ruled jointly by a Holy Roman Emperor and Pope, but rather here you have the notion of the Christian Commonwealth, the Christian Republic, the Christian nation. And still, infant baptism played a role in initiating somebody into the Christian society. So if you're baptized as an infant, all right, you're initiated into the church and subsequently into the Christian society. So what made somebody like Patient potentially dangerous, as would have been the case with Roger Williams, as would have been the case with John Clark, is when in that context, given that whole paradigm of the Christian Commonwealth, if you start to question infant baptism, which was really the essential rite, the essential initiatory rite into the Christian society by way of the church, well, then you undermine the whole notion of the Christian state, therefore the whole notion of a Christian society, therefore you're something of a subversive and a danger really to the well-being of society. So Patient when he was arguing for this, would have been considered that kind of an individual. So to make a complicated a very complex story short, which we try to summarize in the introduction of this work. Patient then eventually leaves Massachusetts Bay. By his own account, he went to Virginia for a while, but then eventually he finds himself going back to England. Now, at the time that he returns to England, the Civil War was already taking place. Parliament was pretty much in charge of the country at this point, and it's in the midst of all this that Oliver Cromwell, who was the commander of the New Model Army, eventually becomes the Lord Protector, and so is really under his tenure of Lord Protector that Patient's work, especially as a Baptist, really starts to take shape. Now, before he goes to Ireland, he met the acquaintance of William Kiffin, and he had worked very closely and intimately with William Kiffin before this. Well, in the meantime, what's interesting about Cromwell's protectorship, although even today in England it would still be regarded as somewhat controversial, and certainly the majority of English subjects would not necessarily be sympathetic towards his Lord Protectorship. But one of the distinct features of Cromwell's policy was his attitude towards religious toleration. And so it was during his protectorship that, interestingly, the Baptists enjoyed the greatest degree of freedom they ever had up until that time, and certainly since after the end of Cromwell's protectorship. But nevertheless, it was during his protectorship that the Baptists enjoyed considerable freedom to practice and to teach the faith as they understood it, based on their reading of Scripture. So it's interesting in this regard that during the Civil War there were quite a few Baptists who were in the New Model Army, and interestingly, Baptists had very close ties with the army under Cromwell. So eventually, as a matter of course, again, to summarize a lot which could get pretty complex, Parliament is interested in the further reform of the church in Ireland. Now, under Elizabeth and the early Stuarts, there was an attempt to fully establish the Church of England there in Ireland. Probably one of the most famous leaders of the Church of England in Ireland during the early 17th century was Archbishop Usher, the Archbishop of Armagh. But nevertheless, it never really took deep effect in the country. So, as a matter of policy, Parliament was very deeply interested in a robust evangelical presence. So as a matter of course, they recruited a series of preachers to help establish that kind of a presence there in Ireland, regardless as to whether they were independents or Baptists. And it just so happened that Thomas Patient was one of these individuals. And so in the 1640s, late 1640s, Patient goes to Ireland, especially Dublin, and there he plays a very, very significant role in helping to establish a pretty solid Baptist community there in Dublin. And as long as policy was sympathetic towards Baptists and other dissenters, the progress there would have increased. It would have been very successful, and it just so happened that when Patient was doing his work there in Ireland, the Cromwellian governor of Ireland was very sympathetic towards Baptists. Although he himself wasn't a Baptist, he himself was sympathetic towards Baptists. But then what happened was, later on, another governor comes in who isn't necessarily so sympathetic, and so for that reason, support is withdrawn. Support is withdrawn. Eventually, Patient returns to England. Now, it's interesting that towards the end of his career, he is he's right in the midst of the post-Cromwellian era with the Restoration, and with the Clarendon Code having been enacted, which certainly was not very sympathetic to Baptists by any means. John Bunyan being something of an example, and so, but interestingly, sometime after Patient returns to England, he joins up with William Kiffin once again, and works with him, and laboring faithfully as a pastor, even though it's as a dissenter, even though it's technically by this time illegal, but he labors faithfully as a Baptist in London eventually, until he dies from an outbreak of the plague in 1666.
Well, thank you so much, Andre, for that thorough biographical sketch about the life and significance of Thomas Patient. Regarding our discussion on the book, Doctrine of Baptism, that Patient wrote, where in the midst of all of that historical context does this work fit into? And what would you say was the relevance of that book to the Baptists who were amongst Patient, so his contemporaries? How was that work received? Do we have any knowledge of how it was received during that era? And as we transition now into our 21st century context, what would you say would be the relevance to such a work today?
That's a great question, Dewey. Thank you. And let me back up a little bit. I forgot to mention in our survey a very significant aspect of a Patient's career, and that is that he participated in the drafting of the First London Confession of 1644 and was one of its signatories. So all that to say, he was very much engaged in matters of doctrine, in matters of clarifying doctrine. So where does the doctrine of baptism come in? Well, it was published in 1654. He most likely wrote this after he was in Ireland, and the purpose I would say would be at least twofold. One, it was to give Baptists, and those whom we would call particular Baptists in this case, it was to give Baptists a thorough biblical and theological grounding for the doctrine of credo baptism or believer's baptism. That was the first thing. Secondly, it was to vindicate the Baptists, and in this case a particular Baptist, as not just simply being reformed, but probably the most consistently reformed of others who certainly would have self-identified as being reformed. And so I would say those were the main purposes, because we have to remember, even though what the Church of England was during Cromwell's protectorate was outlawed in a sense, yet there were still not just those who are part of the Church of England as what we would call Episcopalians, but there were also Presbyterians, and there were Independents, we have to remember, who strongly advocated for infant baptism as really a sine qua non for the of Reformed theology, and especially with respect to the doctrine of the covenant of grace, which really hermeneutically undergirds Reformed theology. And so it becomes very apparent when you read through this work, Patient's concern as somebody who's reformed, as somebody who's a reformed pastor, is trying to establish the Baptist position as being the most consistently reformed as a result of what he would consider to be a much better reading and apprehension of covenant theology, specifically with reference, obviously, to the covenant of grace.
Yeah, it's really helpful, as well as we have considered a biographical sketch of Thomas Patient. We've talked about the significance of this work and the various doctrines associated with the doctrine of baptism and understanding what we think biblical baptism is. But one thing that we're also especially interested to hear about from you is the passion that you have for recovering Baptist history. I think you already alluded to that, especially in your introduction of the editing process of this book. You mentioned how you desired to bring Thomas Patient, and as much as you can, his voice into our day. Do you have any tips or advice for recovering Baptistic works, or tips about being a well-informed church historian, or do you have any other further encouragements or thoughts about ways that we should recover Thomas Patient specifically? Feel free to take this question or this answer to these questions wherever you want.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Austin. I appreciate it. Well, certainly, I think to begin with, when we're trying to recover, in this case, something like substantial theologically rich Baptistic works, I think we have to ask the question, what's the intention? Because the intention is going to determine which among all these different works we choose to recover as a matter of what we may call ressourcement. So I think that I say this because I think it's important to distinguish between something strategic and intentional in this regard from that of somebody just simply being a mere antiquarian. So, and by antiquarian I mean somebody who's interested in just recovering older works for the sake of just for the sake of recovering older works, driven by a mere antiquarian interest. It needs to be intentional. So, and that comes down to why. So, in this particular case, and again, I'm not going to, this is not the place to go into all the details and some of the contentious issues facing that many Baptists face in their various circles, like in the Southern Baptist Convention and all the various controversies of late that have been raging there. But for one thing, I think there is, and I've gathered this just from talking to pastors, pastors who are of Baptist pastors who are of Reformed conviction, and that is that I think there's a crisis in Baptist identity right now. And I think, and again, without trying to be polemical here by any means, I think that is plainly evident in much of the controversy that has been occurring in the Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, just to use that as an example, and not to mention that there are others who may not be Southern Baptists, but there are others who have something of a caricature of what it means to be Reformed. And there's also a narrative out there that maintains that being Baptist and being Reformed are two diametric opposites. And certainly the recovery of such works, especially something like Patience' Doctrine of Baptism, shows the contrary. It shows the exact opposite. So, as a matter of fact, I think we could say, and again, understand, I'm not trying to be partisan here by any means, but I think arguably it were the particular Baptists who in the 17th century were very, very seriously theologically oriented. And you don't have among the particular Baptists, you don't have, interestingly, the kind of anti-intellectualism that some of the general Baptists would have had. Now, although certainly not all, but it's the anti-intellectualism, the anti-scholarship, things like this were somewhat more prevalent among some of the general Baptists than among particular Baptists. The particular Baptists wanted to, on the one hand, they were interested in maintaining their identity as a biblical group. All right, that's the first thing they're interested in doing. But at the same time, and again, this is where historical context becomes very relevant, and that is they want to make it very clear they're not Anabaptists. They're not out to undermine society and all of this. I mean, that's the very thing they're trying to say otherwise. So coming back to our question here, I would say, that in recovering these kinds of Baptistic works, I think there has to be some kind of an intention behind it. And I would summarize everything that I've said at this point by saying the intention behind it has to be to edify the church. End of story in that regard. So that would be the first piece of advice that I would give, broadly speaking. And then the second piece of advice I would give is that anyone who would think of undertaking such a task has to be patient, no pun intended. has to be, they have to appreciate that it is painstaking, tedious, and careful work. It's great work. It's rewarding work. And I think is a valuable work for the church. But again, it's something that one has to, it's one whose complexity one has to appreciate. But then again, I believe, just like anything else, it's something to which one has to be called. And then being a well-informed church historian, I would say, it may sound a bit simplistic on my part, but I would say at the end of the day, what's important here is that somebody who aspires to be a church historian, whether it be a Baptist church historian specifically, or work in some other area of church history, you have to be willing. You have to be willing to read, and be up on the field as much as possible. So I would say, in practical terms, here's what it would mean. I think, first of all, it's important to determine what area you're interested in. That's the first thing. You have to determine what area you're interested in, because that would become your area of specialization. And if you're just starting out, that might begin with an individual. It could be an individual, or it could be, if it's historical theology, it could be a particular doctrine, and read all. And coming back to an individual in this case, like a Thomas Patient or a Benjamin Keach or someone like that, read all that you can on that person, and always make sure that you read the most current literature in terms of monographs, articles, etc., that are out there, because that's how you become best informed. And also, don't ever be afraid to read primary sources. In the case of Thomas Patient, read what Patient himself actually wrote. Read what Keach actually wrote. Read what Bunyan actually wrote. And do so in the light of other works that are on these individuals, their context, and their ideas, because then you become familiar with it. And then as you become increasingly familiar with it, you're able to eventually find some area that hasn't been adequately dealt with, to which then you can contribute. And always remember, I think what distinguishes a church historian from some of his or her counterparts who are secular would be this, that you're trying to do two things. You're trying to do academic work, academic scholarship that ultimately edifies the church.
Amen. Well, we've been talking with Andre Gazal about his work in editing and republishing The Doctrine of Baptism by Thomas Patient. Andre, as we draw our conversation to a close today, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us related to today's conversation, related to your work with H&E Publishing, or anything that you would like to say by way of conclusion?
Oh, certainly. Thanks very much, Dewey. Appreciate that. I would say that H&E Publishing is rendering a tremendously invaluable service to the church. They are always regularly releasing significant works on history, theology, especially in those, obviously mainly in those areas that are not just simply for the trained scholars. They're also for any interested believer who wants to deepen his or her own theological understanding, not just for their own edification, but ultimately for the sake of their own service to the church. And so I would encourage anyone to go on their website and just investigate the vast array of resources that they have to offer.
Well, Andre, it's been a joy to have you on the show today. We wish you nothing but the best in your future academic and ministry endeavors moving forward. Let me just say what you said by way of concluding our previous question regarding how academic scholarship is ultimately to be oriented for the edification of the church amongst Christian scholars and aspiring Baptist scholars. That's so important. So to our listeners who aspire to the kind of work that Andre is doing and others like him are doing, always remember that your service is ultimately to be oriented for the good of the church and for the glory of God. So, Andre, we really appreciate your efforts to that end. To our listeners, we want to encourage you also, if you haven't done so already, go to H&E Publishing, purchase this work. You will be tremendously blessed by the thought of Thomas Paine as you've been introduced to that thought today over the course of our conversation. We wish you nothing but the best, listener, in your efforts to become further acquainted with Paine. And until next time, we do want to wish you grace and peace from the Covenant Podcast. God bless you.
For additional content, check out our blog ministry at covenantconfessions.com. Also, keep up with our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Lastly, thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.